Hi everyone, my name is Christina. I'm also known as Camper Christina, and I'm here today to do a virtual presentation on overcoming challenges while solo tripping. Now you will find that a lot of these challenges can happen whether you're alone or you're with other people. Now here's a bit about me if you don't know who I am. In 2002, I did my very first backcountry trip ever and I fell in love. I wanted to be in the backcountry as much as possible. And I did do a lot of trips, but I didn't do as many as I wanted to. So in 2015, I headed out on my very first solo trip. I had a blast. I was terrified because I'm afraid of the dark and I probably had enough glow sticks with me to start a rave, but I got about 5 hours of sleep, I made it through the night, and the solo trips from there got easier and easier. The winter came and I have a YouTube channel. I can't just do trips spring, summer, and fall. So I decided I would need to winter camp. Now, being someone that doesn't like the cold and the snow, I decided to build a hot tent. And well, it kind of goes like the story of the three bears. One was too heavy, one was too small, the other one was just right. I made a hot tent teepee. It was far too heavy to take into the backcountry, even though I did try. So I made a solo tent that I could take into the backcountry all by myself. Then a few years later, I made a bigger tent so that I could go into the backcountry with friends. Now I was set. I could go into the backcountry by myself anytime I wanted, year-round. The trips got harder and harder and more remote as the years passed. In 2020, I did 20 trips, including 2 of the hardest trips I've ever done in my life. Those trips were in an area called Temagami, which is in Ontario, Canada, and a lot of people consider this Northern Ontario. It is home to the Temiagami Anishinaabe, and it's a really remote place that I love to do adventures in. Most of the trips that I'll be referencing today are in and around this area. The first trip that I'm going to be talking a lot about during this presentation is a trip that I did which I called the Twinkle Lake Loop. It was a 5-day solo trip through a remote area in Temagami, and it was in early July, so I was in the height of bug season and struggling through a heat wave. The other trip that I'm going to be referencing quite a lot is an end-to-end trip that I did, which I called the Waterfalls trip. And it was also in a remote area of Temagami. I loved this trip because the portages were really difficult and there was amazing scenery everywhere. I made a video about the first 2 topics that I'm going to cover, which are getting there and accesses. Here it is. I hope you enjoy it. I was told that it was going to be really hard to get down this road. I brought all the things. I have shovels in my car and plywood and tire fixer and extra, like a battery booster, but driving over a sinkhole, it's not even wide enough for me to get through here. There's no way I can get through here. I'm still looking at this bridge trying to figure out how I drove over it. As I hear my car start and drive away. Oh God. There's no way to do this safely. There just is no way to do this safely. But I went to reach for it, it was too far away, so I slid and found myself on my belly. I found it! The road intersects the portage, and part of it goes to the right, and part of it goes to the left. I was supposed to just go from the road that way. This whole place is hills, and I got a good, like, 3/4 of the way up, and then I just couldn't pull it anymore, so I tied the sled to a tree. Well, that's where I came out of. A little hole right there, and now I'm in this. So the water in front of me is all ice, and I can't get through. I can already tell that this one's going to be fun. This is slippery. Good times. Oh, that took a little bit of gymnastics to get the canoe in the water. Holy smokes. I don't know how I'm gonna get my stuff in the canoe. I don't know. There's a roadblock at every turn on this portage. Holy smokes. Oh man, this looks like a good time. I don't even want to get out of the boat. I just have to go up and over all these boulders. So as you can see, getting there and the accesses can be a challenge just in itself on some of these trips. Here in this slide, you can see that there is a very rough road, and this is actually the road into the Twinkle Lake Loop. Now, I parked my car at the end of it, and I knew it was going to be a rough road, so I decided to walk it with my hedge clippers and my saw and remove any branches and dead trees, and there was all kinds of down trees and stuff all along this road. So I got down about 1 kilometer. I was doing really well, even though the bugs were eating me alive, and I got to this spot on the road. It was full of sinkholes. There were sinkholes here about a year before, and they had been repaired by the maintenance crew from the Friends of Temagami. However, by the looks of it, they had opened back up, and there was no way that I was going to be able to drive my vehicle down this road. I did have some really big pieces of plywood, and at one point I thought, you know, maybe I'll just lay them over top and I could drive over it really fast. But I knew that that was not going to be a good solution. If something happened to me out there, there's nobody coming down these roads and there's nobody out here. And so what I had to do was drive back down the logging road, which was about an hour, to the next campsite that I had researched on the map just in case something happened. And I was met with this questionable bridge. Now, there are a lot of bridges like this in the Temagami area that I've kind of gone over in the last few years. And this is just a picture of one of them that I had because I didn't take pictures of the other ones. I just kind of braced myself and drove over them as best as I could. I managed to make it, but I do carry a lot of things with me in my car in case something happens on these roads and these areas. I have a portable charger which has jumper cables for my car. It also has an air compressor so I can fill my tire in case it gets low or it gets punctured. I have tire filler, and I have a whole assortment of tools and plywood and all kinds of things with me just in case. When you go out on these trips by yourself, you really have to be prepared because anything can happen. About a month later, I headed back out to do the Twinkle Lake Loop because I was told there was a new access. I was thrilled. I finally got there. I drove up. I saw the nice little yellow sign on the tree where the portage was, and off I went. I didn't even realize that I was going down the wrong side of the portage on the wrong side of the road. I was pretty sure that this trip was doomed from the start, but I did eventually make it out. As you can see, I'm here. But it was very challenging just getting to do this trip in the first place. For the waterfalls trip, it was an end-to-end trip, so I needed to get a shuttle. Now, all of my trips in the past have been loops, and the reason for that is because I do them by myself and I don't have anyone to drive one of the cars to one end and leave another car at the other end. So I asked my friend Dave, who lives in Temagami, if he would help me out with this trip. And thankfully he said yes, or I would have never been able to do this trip. Now you can also get an outfitter to do shuttle service. A lot of them in this area do it. I don't know about the areas that you go to, but it's something you could look into if this is something you're interested in. Impassable trails were all around me all last year. This is a trip that I did in March, just before we got put on lockdown. I had done a trip in this area before, and I knew that the trails were a little bit narrow and there were cliffs, along the side of some of them, and they were a bit treacherous. So I thought that I would be a smarty pants, and instead of bringing my hot tent and pulling my toboggan along and having the chance of my toboggan sliding down off one of these cliffs off the trail, I was going to bring my backpack and I wasn't going to have any problems. Well, instead of the toboggan sliding down the hill, I slid down the hill. There was a section that was icy, which wasn't quite as bad as the one pictured here. And just before this section, which I slipped off of and landed on my belly, and kind of was a little bit freaked out. When I got to this area, I knew there was no way that I was getting through, even just with little old me and my backpack and no toboggan. So I turned myself around and I rerouted the trip, and I ended up going somewhere else. When you're by yourself, you really have to be smart. You can't just kind of say, oh, well, you know what, I can do it, and then you put yourself in a bad situation. You can put yourself in danger, and you can put other people in danger who might have to come and rescue you. So I just decided it was best for everyone and myself to just go somewhere else. And I ended up having a great trip there. Uphill struggles is something that I face a lot in the winter time. Because I am alone, I have to carry everything that I need on my toboggan all by myself. Now, when you're going with someone else in the winter time, you know, you can split the gear and you can put like the stove on one toboggan and the tent on another toboggan and split up the poles and kind of balance out the weight so that you're not carrying as much. But when you're alone, that's not an option. And so I have a really hard time going up hills in the winter time because they're slippery and the toboggan is very heavy. I've crawled up some of them on my hands and knees. I also keep a rope with me, which is handy so that I can tie it to the toboggan in case I get into, you know, some kind of an issue. I can tie it around a tree, as I had mentioned that I did in the video, or I can use it to wrap around a tree and kind of use as a pulley system, which is also helpful. I have also unloaded my toboggan at the bottom of many hills and carried all of the items up one by one and then reloaded the toboggan. And yes, it is very time consuming, but I still ended up getting to my destination safely. And on the way down, the hills can be quite fun. Ice is a challenge that I met with surprisingly on a canoe trip that I did in November. We usually don't get our ice in until about mid-December, end of December, in many places in the area that I go tripping in. So I had decided to do a trip, probably my not last canoe trip of the season. And when I got there, I thought, wow, look at this bay. It's so calm and the water's like mirror. It was glassy. It was gorgeous. I got in the canoe and I got about 10 or 15 feet and then the canoe stopped. And at that point, I realized that the entire bay was frozen solid with just a little tiny bit of water on top to make it look pretty. I ended up having to put the canoe back on the car and go to another lake. Probably about like 1% of the lakes in this area had ice on them, and I just, of course, had to hit that lake. So what I did was I just rerouted to another lake, and all was fine. Access points are another topic that I'm going to cover today, and some of the access points in these remote areas are just bonkers. Here is an access point. I know you probably can't tell by the picture, but this right here is where you get into the water from the end of the portage on one of my trips in Temagami. Basically what I had to do after conquering this horrible portage in the first place was to get myself in the canoe and all my gear through these tiny holes. I kind of just made myself really small and squished myself through there. I was standing in water almost up to my waist because it's all swampy there. But eventually I got through and I got out to the water. Well, or so I thought. Here is a view of the little tiny hole right here that I came out of. And I was happy to get onto the water, but then found out that this is what I was going to be paddling through next. This is a little bit of a slog fest, and paddling through swampy grasses can be very difficult, but eventually I did make it through and got out there and on my way. Challenging accesses were everywhere on the Waterfalls canoe trip especially. This is the access into the water from the Cabin Falls portage. And basically, you can't really tell in the picture. I was so elated to be done with this portage that I didn't really get a good photo. But the bottom of the portage is kind of like a giant triangle. And so it was really hard to get the canoe in the water because it was also on a steep, steep hill. It was hard to get the canoe in the water and get my gear into it. So what I did for this trip was I tied a rope to the bow and the stern of the canoe. And that way I could kind of pull the bow over to the rocks, put the rope underneath my foot while I kind of grabbed my pack and balanced myself and got it into the canoe, and then flipped the canoe around and did the same thing with the stern, and then crawled over all of my gear to kind of get myself seated back into the canoe. It was a bit of a challenge, but it was quite a fun one to overcome. Now, the accesses on the Waterfalls canoe trip were insane. Here is one that might not look that crazy, but the rocky shorelines were a bit of a challenge for me. And basically, they were just boulders and then water, and there was no ledge or anywhere where you could stand. So what I ended up doing was scratching the canoe quite a bit because I would have to load my backpack into the canoe and then slowly let it down into the water, sliding it down on the rocks, and then kind of flip it around and get myself into it. This wet access is at the end of the Shangri-La Portage, which was a beautiful, beautiful area. I had to do some gymnastics here to get myself and the canoe into the water properly, and did have to get myself pretty wet, getting into the water up to my thighs so that I could load the pack and get myself into the canoe safely. Some of these accesses are just crazy, and you have to kind of be creative, take your time, and just get in and get your stuff in there however you can and get on your way. I made a video of the next topic that I'm going to be talking about, which is portages, or portages as some of you say. Here it is. I hope you enjoy it. Objects are much steeper than they appear on video. I found the awful part. It's right here. I do see another way. Someone has finagled. And I think I'm going to try that. Sometimes the little ones are the biggest pain in the ass. I don't even know where my feet are. Oh, I found the trail again. Here. And then down. And then all the way up that. And then up that. This is an evil, evil trail. This is just the last part of it. This looks fun. This is the stuff, if you can see. This is the water that I'm like trying to struggle through, the bushes. I'm just, again, covered in deer flies. Okay, this is a steep part. As you see, you sink really deep into the mud and then you lose your shoe. There's a lot of fancy footwork. There's rocks and all of a sudden the ground sinks. There's a tree smacking in the side of the canoe. I had a bit of a wipeout. It's the second one of the day. The first one was on that very, very first portage. Like 3 steps in with the backpack, I slipped. Like I said, the terrain here is really tough. I tripped on a stick and I went down, the canoe went down, landed on my hand. Everything's fine, I'm okay. You can't see a trail anywhere, like it's so hard to see a trail. Meeny, meeny, miny, moe. I went both directions. Can't find a sign anywhere, so I don't know. I hope I get out. There's my boat way over there. Well, now I know why we learned how to crab walk in the gym class as a kid. That is evil. That was the longest, hardest 50-meter portage I've ever done in my life. That might be my portage right there. Thankfully, that was not the portage, but it did look quite similar and was a really, really big challenge. Portages, the next topic that I'm going to talk about in my presentation. They were just crazy on these trips. When you go to remote areas, you really never know what to expect. Now, you probably can't tell by this picture, but this is actually a portage in Temagami, which was on the Twinkle Lake Loop. And you can find a faint trail most of the time. It's not a problem. The problem with this portage is that it is really overgrown, and as you can see, there's ferns and bushes and all kinds of foliage covering the trail. So when you're walking along underneath those, there's rocks and boulders and branches and tree limbs and all kinds of stuff. So you really have to take your time and walk very slowly so that you don't trip and end up falling and hurting yourself. Rocky portages were everywhere on the waterfalls canoe trip especially. And what I noticed as the trip went on was that the rocks got bigger and bigger and bigger. This is a portage that I couldn't find, so I ended up having to walk the canoe and all of my gear along the rocky shoreline. And even these small rocks I find to be quite challenging. They get wet, they're slippery, they've got moss on them, and you really have to watch your footing. Rocks and boulders were everywhere, as I mentioned on the waterfalls trip, and they got bigger and bigger. And here is the next difficult portage that I did. It was a 50-meter portage. It took me almost 45 minutes to do it. You have to make sure that you're going through these areas when it's dry. I planned the trip around the weather so that I knew that I wasn't going to have that added stress of having to walk on slippery, wet rocks. But some of them were still wet and covered in moss and still slippery. And on this particular portage, there was actually water running underneath the rocks as well. So there's a little bit of a mind game going on. I got about 2/3 of the way through with the canoe, and then I just kind of froze on the spot and I couldn't move anymore. I just got really, really scared. I didn't know which rock to pick. I have a habit of stepping on that rock. That's the one that moves, and it happens every single time to me. I was actually going to do 2 more portages on this day, but after doing this portage, there was a campsite right across from it, and I decided to spend the night there because my legs were so shaky from this portage that I just knew that I needed to stop at that point. Boulders and logs was the next thing that I started to see on the portages, getting closer and closer to the waterfalls area on this trip. Thankfully, Hap Wilson, who's a famous canoe legend, has his eco lodge nearby, and he clears these trails often. But there's still a lot of debris. There's downed trees and logs, and the boulders were just insane. Just getting the canoe and your gear up out of the water, getting onto the portage, and then climbing over these boulders. Some of them have a foot of gap in between them. And, it's really challenging when you've got a canoe on your head to be boulder hopping over these rocks. So, again, you just have to be really careful and take your time. Steep portages. The waterfalls canoe trip had several of them. There were 3 daunting, very difficult, steep, rocky portages on this trip, in addition to all the flat ones that you saw. And they were nothing to mess with. These portages were some of the hardest portages I've ever done in my life. And how I got through them was I broke them down into flights. So, like a flight of stairs, I would say that, this portage had 5 flights of stairs. And in my mind, I would just tackle one flight, take a little break, look around, have a rest, tackle the next flight, and I would just go down them that way. And it seemed to help by compartmentalizing the portages into smaller sections. Some of these portages were only 200 or 300 yards, but they were still so dangerous and so difficult. And thankfully, I was going through them on a day where there was no rain. So that added obstacle wasn't there for me, but I can't imagine doing these in wet weather. They would just be brutal. The portages got steeper. As I mentioned, there were 3 that were just really, really difficult on the waterfalls canoe trip, and this is probably the hardest portage that I have ever done in my life. It was incredibly steep, and not only that, but the rock was very smooth and flat, and I knew that it was coming. I was prepared for it, but when I saw it, I was just like, wow, how am I going to do that? What I did was I kept a 50-foot rope out of my pack. I always carry one with me, but I kept it handy on this morning when I packed everything so that it was right pretty much on my person. And when I got to this section, I pretty much had 2 options here. One was to kind of tie the rope around this tree here and then rappel myself down this steep, smooth rock. But when I got there, I discovered that there was actually an alternate route. The wonderful Hap Wilson and his wife Andrea had somehow secured this log to the side of the cliff. And luckily for me, I took gymnastics when I was a kid. So I kind of, made my way over. It was a lot easier with the pack than the canoe, but I just took my time on shaky legs and got over my little balance beam and down the cliff to the water. And when I got to see the waterfalls that were at the bottom, it was totally worth it. Blowdowns were all over the portages on the Twinkle Lake Loop especially. I know that there was a maintenance trip in the area. I think it was about a year before. And so I knew the area was pretty good, but there were still a lot of blowdowns. I mean, you can have a big storm and all of a sudden there's tons of blowdowns on the portages. So, you just kind of have to get creative and lift your legs up really high and take your time through these areas so that you make it through without falling and hurting yourself. Where's the Portage was a game that I played quite a bit on the Twinkle Lake Loop especially. The last day of my trip, on my way out, of course, I ran into this beautiful portage. It was only 300 yards, and I didn't have any idea that I was in for any trouble when I got there until I took a look out and couldn't see a trail anywhere. The portages, which are also known as the Nostogan, have been there for thousands of years, and I can almost always see a very faint trail through. But on this portage, there was nothing. I could not see a trail to save my life. Many of the Nostogan have axe blazes on the trees, so you can make your way through. But as you can see in the picture here, there aren't a lot of trees in the area, so there weren't any axe blazes to look for. There was barely any trail tape. The ground was covered in alder bushes and ferns and rocks, and it was swampy, and it was really hard to get through. It took me 3 times longer than normal to get through this portage, but eventually I did find the water, and I was so happy until a few portages later where I was playing the game again of Where's the Portage? This is a 700-meter portage, which I believe is about a half a mile, and it took me 3 hours to find the water. And that doesn't, say that I have bad navigation skills or anything like that. I have my map and compass courses. I go through a lot of these areas. I have a GPS. But I just could not find my way through this trail for the longest time. And, again, swampy, overgrown, very few axe blazes. I found some axe blazes on down trees eventually, but it took me a really long time to get through this. And when I finally got to where I thought was the end of the portage, I was at an ATV road and there was still no water in sight. So I walked around in any direction that I could think of, and eventually I did find the water and I did get out, but I was just such an emotional mess on that day. It was so hard to keep my spirits up. But that's what you have to do when you're on trips like this. You can't give up. I got comments on my videos of people saying, I would have just given up, but there's not that option when you're out in a place like this. My option was to go 4 days back through all the stuff that I had just come through, or to find my way to the other end. And eventually I did make it. You just have to keep your spirits up and, sing a song, repeat a mantra, and find your way to the other end. Swampy is a word that I used a lot of on the Twinkle Lake Loop. Even though it was July, there was still a lot of very wet areas on the route, and this is a 900-meter portage, which is, I think, about 0.6 miles. There was supposed to be a portage here, which I found out when I got done with the trip that it doesn't actually exist. And what I ended up having to do was to drag the canoe through this little trickle of water, and it was quite far, as you can see in the little inset picture here. As I had mentioned earlier, it was a heat wave, and I was in the height of bug season. So what I did on this trip is to make sure that you are prepared gear-wise. I have a full bug suit that I wear when I go out in bug season. I have pants, I have a shirt, I have a head net. I like to wear a baseball hat that keeps the head net off of your face. And I also had my clothes thoroughly sprayed with permethrin. Now, these things don't keep you from getting bitten entirely, but they do help a lot to keep the craziness away. For you people who have been out in these situations, I know you understand what I'm talking about. You're hot, you're sticky, you're smelly, you're frustrated, and all you want to do is get to the water. And you just have to be patient, be happy that you're wearing the right gear, and take your time and get through. Fun is what I had on all of these portages, accesses, getting there. I love a good challenge. I really, really do. And these trips provided those obstacles for me to overcome, which I truly enjoy. I might sound like I'm complaining a lot, but I'm not at all. I really, really love to find a challenge and overcome it and finish that trip. It just gives you such a great feeling when you do. Why do I face all these challenges? Well, I absolutely love them. I have actually made a video of all of the rewards and the great moments that I've had on these trips in 2020. And here it is. I hope you enjoy it.
Wow. Just stunning. Spectacular indeed. This is the happiest day of my life. Get the fire going, and I'm sitting here listening to the Tragically Hip on Canada Day. I'm laying here reading my book. And look at the view I have. I have a moon coming up over the lake. It's beautiful. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a moose. I wish I could get a closer look. But that's okay. This is what I was greeted by right in front of my tent. Isn't it beautiful? It's like, you know, when they say you die and you see that golden light, that's what it looks like. It's so cool. It's absolutely stunning out here. So beautiful. I'm just so happy, at peace, fulfilled. I just feel so wonderful. It's sunny, it's summer, it's August. It's gorgeous out. I'm on this huge, beautiful, crystal clear lake all by myself. Wow. It's wolves howling. Oh my God. Beautiful, look at that. I'm so happy with the weather. I'm so happy and pleasantly surprised that it's not raining right now. Absolutely beautiful here. But there's a moose running down the road in front of my car. Oh my gosh. And there is beautiful Cabin Falls. In a few hours, I will have completed that goal. And I'm really, really proud of myself. I made it! Yeah! I can still, right now, feel the way that I felt when I completed that portage. That video clip was taken at the bottom of the Bridalveil Falls portage, which was the hardest portage that I've ever completed in my life, and I did it alone. And not only that, it was the third of the 3 most difficult portages that I had on my trip. It was such a great feeling, and I was so happy with myself, and I think I will remember that moment for a very, very long time. Overcoming challenges while solo tripping, for me, is an important part of the adventure, and it can be the best part if you're prepared. Wear the proper gear, take your time, and get out there, and you could experience your greatest adventure yet. Thank you so much for checking out my virtual presentation. I really hope you enjoyed it. And if you'd like to see more of my adventures, please check out my YouTube channel at Camper Christina. Thanks so much for watching. Bye.